In general, what I wanted to talk about today were some of the ways in which the stack thesis sees cities and understands the processes and the processes, power, conditions of the city layer within the stack, and perhaps the other way around as well, how the city might see the rest of the stack. And part of what I'll try to impart is perhaps a bit of distinction between what is arguably new about the way in which an emergent planetary scale computational infrastructure reformulates or reprograms the urban, and what in some senses has been part and parcel, if not deeply intrinsic to the modern city as a whole. The picture that's up here at the beginning is from 1914. This is Powerline's network in Vancouver, in Canada. And as John and I were just sort of referring to earlier, it's sort of amazing how, in many respects, nothing has really changed. Some of it remains superterranean or subterranean, visible and invisible, but the principle of a series of tubes around which we organize habitation remains. All right, so let's sort of, perhaps as a kind of return to the prologue, we'll begin a bit sort of where we return very briefly to where we began at the beginning about a remark that the outgoing Secretary of State Clinton had made about the need for a new geopolitical architecture that would describe the structures and conditions in which we're now situated. Her recommendation of Frank Gehry is the model of this. You'll recall we had some things to say about in the first lecture. But the issue that we want to focus on from this as well, and this understanding of the stack, which we're proposing as a kind of both a technical model that would describe the apparatus in which we live and around which we situate and embed the urban, as what we call an accidental megastructure. The question of the megastructure, which obviously has a rich and varied and probably still under-realized history within our architectural thought, is one we'll also return to towards the end of this discussion a bit. I also want to say at the beginning is that the remarks that we'll sort of go for may sort of slip between what may seem as a kind of critical tone or a really observational one. The issue for me in our discussion of this perhaps in some ways has less to do, at least at the outset, with whether or not we want to identify a particular trend or condition as being in advance negative or in advance positive, and then thereby align and throw our lot with it accordingly, but to hold those, is to be a bit more nuanced about it, and to understand that just as projects or intentions that may have started off as being utopian in their purpose and their vision and their articulation have soured into their inverse, into dystopian kinds of developments, that the inverse is equally true, and that what may first appear quite reasonably as a despotic or at least unlikable set of conditions may in its own way hold the genetic material by which its own inversion is possible. And so what I'm asking is less to suspend or to mute your critical faculties, but to use them in such a way that the reversibility, invertibility, is always held as not the exception to the rule, but as the rule itself. Or as Buckminster Fuller said, it will be utopian or dystopian. It can go either way. It'll be touch and go until the last instant. And towards that last instant, it oscillates back and forth over and over again. All right. So I want to begin by going back a little bit in time to the Paleolithic era of the digital age, the 1990s, long ago, and to speak to two texts from this era that were and remain, I think, foundational perspectives on what's at work in how it is that the city is situated as a form of computational, as a computational mechanism, and how it configures our own habitation and circulation in its image thereby. The first point is that to the extent to which we want to understand the emergence of the deliberate and accidental sovereignties, platform sovereignties, urban sovereignties, political sovereignties that the stack brings with it, to the extent to which you want to identify these as the appearance of some new regime, or as the potential larval appearance of some kind of new regime, at the very least. We may compare it to how it is that other new regimes have appeared. And in doing so, understand that unlike the storming of the Bastille, the falling of the Vendôme column, the decapitation of the king, the renaming of the streets, or any of these other kinds of more attacks of the center, retaking of some kind of clearly identified symbolic center, and its clearly constructed replacement with a different kind of regime, that the appearances of the sovereignties that we're developing now have happened in a way that's perhaps much more intangible and a certain less visible. Or as I say, unlike modern political states that may have exploded into being by the breaching or the establishment of particular symbolic centers, the constitutional violence, that is the violence that makes a new system, that allows it to take place, to occupy and to defend itself, of planetary scale computations and its sovereignties, has occurred at the surface of the entire city at once, in and on every object, seemingly all at once, as ubiquitous and as convergent as it is partial and partitional, which, if we identified and located in the surfaces of the city in this way, we see it, as I say, at least potentially as a kind of ubiquitous, a ubiquitous procedure. But also at the same time, one in which that is located and perhaps more specifically at what we take to be urban interfaces, the interfaces that we use to interact with the city, that the city uses to interact with itself, that others use to interact with us through the medium of the city, in that this emergence of this condition of sovereignty is potentially everywhere, but it's not everywhere in the exact same way. Some places are more interfacial than others, and in this regard, they become sites by which the logics of that power are concentrated, not centralized, but concentrated. Now, interface, to be clear, as I use this term, in a rather sort of generic sense. An interface is any point of contact between two complex systems, which, as that point of contact, governs the condition of exchange between those systems. So a button with a word on it that you click that causes something to happen that is semantically similar and conceptually similar to what the button says is an interface. But a doorway is an interface, an international border is an interface, ATM machines, all the rest of the things that one way or another structure and condition these terms of interaction can all be interfaces. And they do so, and they become interfaces, they operate in this interfacial capacity not only at the level of the individual user, the one person in front of one apparatus interacting with it, and then thereby with the system as a whole, but also at the scale of the city itself, that the city-to-city level of interfaciality, or continent to continent, or landscape to landscape. One of the ways in which we've seen, particularly over the last, say, 40 years or so, with the acceleration of what Castells called space of flows a long time ago, is the development of a particular kind of urban logic of that landscape scale interfaciality, which we call airports. And the first of the texts that I wanted to speak to, this which is called Overexposed City, 1985 by Paul Virilio, focuses on the airport specifically as a site for this kind, what he calls a dromological power. Dromos meaning to speed or the race. So I write, long ago, the ceremonial interface to a city may have been a bridge or a gate, which, when closed, also shut off the city from the movement of goods and people and ideas and microbes and more. These orifices between cities and periphery were where the martial, that is, the military, risk and complexity of contact was modulated. But now the airport is that interface into the city and to the nation state, regardless of the global point of departure, and regardless of how close the airport is to any actual or formal border. Airports, even in the deep national interior, contain within them legal international borders, safe zones, duty-free zones, security screens, unsafe quarantine zones, and other liminal jurisdictions and complementary policing programs. Liminal and liminality refers to a state of in-betweenness of something. An anthropologist, we talk about when, perhaps in Victor Turner's usage, when a young person will go off for a period of time between the time in which they're supposed to be a child and an adult, and they have their adventure and they come back, and in this period of time they're neither a child or an adult, they're in some liminal state. So it's this unofficial ambiguity. The jurisdictions of airports are liminal in this regard. Movement through the airport's multi-stage rituals of filtering and sorting paces the user through densely juxtaposed police and leisure zones. Police and leisure. Security agents examine and handle your person in ways that are usually reserved for criminals or sans-papiers, undocumented persons. As you pose in the midst of the leisure corridors where summary versions of human culture have been miniaturized into inspirational magazines and the unchallenging solicitations of snack foods. Thus, airport urbanism in general is characterized by this critical cohabitation of security and entertainment. Securitized entertainment, entertaining securitization. So what Virilio called a new topological order, in this order, control is both hard and soft. The machine guns are real, the terrorists' obsession with these sites is real, and the unspoken threat of being grabbed off stage to be questioned behind closed doors by state agents is also real. But no less real are the digital departure and arrival screens, the hyper-legible black on yellow Helvetica signage, the precise strategic placement of coffee carts exactly so many steps from bathrooms, and again, the omnipresent media and candy matrix. Now, human occupation of this space, this soft enveloping of delays and digestion in collaboration with one another, and with collaboration with the hard enveloping of security and filtering, is then elevated now to a general principle of contemporary urbanism. For Virilio, the easygoing layering of the exceptional militarized space with the ambient landscape of airport's generic Singaporeization, as he calls it, of the global city, is positioned at that critical interface connecting urban nodes within an expanded global sphere. It is the model of the city rendered as information, hardware, and software. That is, the airport discloses without fanfare that cities are airports. Airports are not simulations of cities, rather cities are simulations of airports. It's where police deep scan your person while blending you a delicious smoothie of your choosing, and do so without irony, without contradiction, of purpose, or of affect. And this is not only then a surreal pun on despotism as a kind of universal urbanism, the business model also includes the reactive management of individual user actions provoked by this accidentally sadistic little drama. And so, not only then do airports in this way represent a key form of the urban interface in that it is the site by which one urban assemblage, a city, is connected to another, the passageway through which we go in order to connect one to the other. But it is itself also comprised, the immediate habitat of it is comprised by individual, one single unit serving forms of interfaciality, which we'll speak to now. One key point around this that will stay right away is that as we think about the way in which the stack operates as a kind of platform, and the way in which platforms operate within it, it's always not about one mega platform, but platforms nested within platforms, and a kind of overlapping and sometimes asymmetrical nesting of platform within platform, that the dynamic of centralization and decentralization at work is not always so clear. On the one hand, we're arguing that the stack represents a kind of totality, that it is a comprehensive mechanism by which we can see these operations at once. It's global in scope. It operates on principles that are deeply generic, and by that genericity, it allows for kinds of universality of connection and circulation and transference that other forms of other technical systems and institutional systems cannot. But that doesn't mean necessarily that it operates through a principle of centralization. It is perhaps paradoxically, but perhaps not, operates as much through a principle of decentralization. And it does so precisely through how it is that the interfaces, how the interfaces might work. And I say it this way. Interface decentralization becomes the engine of cloud-based centralization as these interfaces become channels of increasing end-user management, swarm intelligence, and spontaneous utility, just as cloud centralization becomes as well the engine of interface decentralization. I'll explain this in a moment. The logic of the city layer of the stack and its logic of power is thus both a kind of decentralized top-down and a centralized bottom-up, as well as kind of directed side-by-side interaction, all monetized as the raw currency of cognition and circulation. As you look over there to gate 12, in the search field, on every screen, in every hand, on every lap where users wait for their flights, we see that what finally empowers the interface is less its function as some coercive frame for all signification and gesture, than that it is so uniquely and relentlessly responsive to the nuances of every user's individual personal desires, interests, and intentions. And it does one so it becomes the other. And as I'll explain a little bit further, we see this in the structure, it works thus. It's precisely through the centralization at the cloud layer. I mean, let's take the banal example of doing Google searches on your phones. This is sort of a key example of this. You may be distributed, all of the free-range users are distributed hither and yon throughout the world able to interact with, use this remote control for their environment in the handheld device, do searches with it, look things up, interact with the world in such a sort of way, in the most decentralized manner possible. You are free to go wherever you like. There is no, and you do so in a way that's otherwise, your itineraries are undetermined. There is no, for example, there is no central command center to which you must appear in order to participate, in order for that interface to work. You don't have to show up at the central building in order for this to happen. There's no there towards which you must depart in order for this to work. And yet, the capacity for that interface to do what it does, which is for you to enter some kind of human sensible semantic string, which is remotely connected to subterranean supercomputing capacity in a data center, and then send back some kind of algorithmically intelligent response to that human legible semantic string, such that it appears to you that the little slab of glass in your hand has supercomputing powers, in which case it's really more of a kind of a window onto the computing happening somewhere else. The decentralization of the use of the interface as people move throughout the city is dependent upon the massive centralization of that computing capacity in the data center itself. Yeah? The decentralization of the interface is dependent upon that centralization. And the inverse is also true, that the centralization is, in essence, dependent upon that decentralization, which is what I'll speak to now. The second essay, and I'll do so in relationship to this second essay from this period, 1990, one of the last things that Gilles Deleuze published was a short piece, which you probably have read, called Postscript on Societies of Control, which is one of the pieces in which, other than the book on Leibniz, the pli, the fold, it's one of the only times in which he explicitly deals with urbanistic and architectural problems, and he does so with a meditation of sorts on the emerging, then 1990, again we're looking at the emergent role of digital and electronic media as an urban structure, as a mode of the urban. I'm sorry, I'm going through these. This is my airport pictures. Okay, so now. His concern then is within a shift, with what he calls from a shift that he calls from one regime of spatial control to another regime of spatial control. And he means these as sort of as historical shifts, but also technical and political shifts. It is a shift, as he sees it, from what he calls a Foucauldian, as in Michel Foucault, disciplinary urbanism, to one of a more free-floating and liquid control society. The disciplinary urbanism of the Foucauldian model is one by which inhabitants are coerced into mass envelopes and schools, factories and prisons and office buildings and barracks. But now, instead, by a logic of power and control that works according to the self-directed movements of users through both open and closed spaces, and the urban gateways or switches that would mitigate, modulate, and master the possibilities of their movements through each of these interfacial points of passage. As a whole, the swarming effects of this are aggregated parametrically through those filtering gateways at each point of purchase by which identity is verified and made true, and the local geography of entertainment. That is, in his description, we move from a logic of the urban by which, in order for political power to organize the distributed social body, instead of it capturing those bodies within fixed, institutionally divided envelopes, a school, a prison, an office, whatever, and where the envelope functions as a means by which to delineate that space, that particular domain of authority, and to coerce acquiescence to its disciplinary logics. The logic of control, as Deleuze sees it, is one in which those envelopes take on a very different function. They don't necessarily delineate an absolute inside from an absolute outside, because ultimately, to the extent to which a planetary-scale computational system is able to identify, interact with, and communicate with users regardless of where they are, according to how they interact with these decentralized interfaces that then connect back to the commanding armature of the cloud platform, there's no outside for them to escape to. And so the necessity of keeping them in the hard envelope is thereby dissipated. No? Now, it's not that all of the spaces are, in essence, equal. They're not. It's not that everything is equally available to everyone. It's not. But that at each point, and this is where I'm at this point now departing from Deleuze's thesis and adding to it in a different way, that each of these gateways through which a user might move, which would identify them as this user versus that user, would credentialize them as having access to this particular inside versus that particular inside versus that one. Function is the same way that gateways functions within computation more generally, of making a binary decision of allowing in or preventing a prevention from entry. And in the aggregation of those trillions and trillions and trillions of decisions by which the urban scale interfaces decide what is available to each one of us, the structure and distribution of that social body is composed. This is the logic of this, yep. So we recognize the city that he describes as filled with suspiciously responsive environments. ATM machines, key cards, parking permits, e-tickets to branded entertainment, personalized recommendation engines, mobile social network transparencies, GPS-enabled monitoring of parolees, customer phone tracking for optimized retail layout optimization, and so forth. And as I say, in the control city, there may not be a Foucauldian disciplinary gate that holds everybody out and everyone in the same way, because there is no outside to which anyone might escape. For other users, the interfacial regime at work already knows in advance that they are not allowed into this generalized gated community, and for those persons, we may call them refugees, there's only the outside. Right. Skip ahead a bit here as well. Okay, so, I wanted to then speak to this function of this, how the decentralization is dependent upon, or the centralization is dependent upon the decentralization. The centralization, the operation of this massively distributed interfacial network that is dependent upon a centralized cloud registration platform and intelligence that may be happening elsewhere. And this dynamic of we see then how the distribution decentralization is dependent upon this central mechanisms, even if it's happening elsewhere and even if you don't have to go to it. The only way in which that platform and the political or social or economic logic of that platform, the one that is operating and making those decisions remotely, let's say your Google, Apple, Amazon, whatever, is able to do so, is because it operates not only as a means by which all of this information can be calculated at once, but because all of those interfaces that are distributed throughout the world function in essence as a kind of sensing mechanism for the algorithmic intelligence that is bound there. It's only able to make those decisions, is able to organize the conditions of exit and entry, of the provision of either martial, the kind of policing control, or the leisure and entertainment provisions in a way that become interchangeable, only because of the massively distributed billions and billions of sensing mechanisms that each of us carry around with us on our person, which we still insist on calling phones, as John and I were just referring to, this kind of inverse skeuomorphism, which I may perhaps talk about. And in these are two, this centralization and decentralization is dependent upon one another. Now, the implications of that, I think, for or probably both straightforward, for urban thought are probably both straightforward and paradoxical in different measures. Things that we normally would think of in terms of center and periphery, core and periphery, take on a different structure. How we would think about what types of functions need to be incorporated into, might be incorporated into envelope, take on a different tenor. And how it is that we think about the specific agency and programmability of the individual inhabitant takes on a different structure as well. Now, I had mentioned that interfaces when we talk about interfaces and interfaciality, we're not only talking about buttons with words on them or graphical user interfaces, that is diagrams or maps that you can click, and that when you click them, something happens that's like the picture itself. But we're not excluding those in any other way as well. And it's important, I think, to understand them, those kinds of diagrammatic interfaces is also having an important cartographic function. It's impossible take a very much more reduced type of apparatus, your phone or your laptop or whatever. It's impossible for you to comprehend or understand or map or conceptualize all of the possible things that the little universal Turing machine inside this piece of plastic and metal can possibly do. And so it's absolutely necessary for its functions and affordances to be both humanly sensible and something that can be responsive to your deliberate compositional intentions. For all of those affordances to be radically reduced and summarized in the form of a reductive cartographic diagram, which we call the graphical user interface. It may be possible for this little Turing machine in your pocket to do any number of different things, but if you've got 4 apps on it, it does those 4 things that it's now that the interface layer has essentially allowed it to do. And this is, I don't mean this as a form of necessarily of criticism of this, because it's actually how these things would work. You don't want a situation in which everyone has to write their own printer driver in order to be able to send email to one another or so forth. The fact that you have these levels of abstraction, and that's really what they are, that there are forms of abstraction that the ultimate universal possibility of calculation that the hardware is capable of is simplified, reduced, and abstracted to the level that it becomes humanly sensible, is absolutely necessary for it to function as a social or political institutional network. It's absolutely essential, because otherwise everyone can't participate in it. And if everyone can't participate in it, it cannot sense what those people are doing, it cannot organize them, it cannot have any kind of efficacy over them at the scale of an entire city. That make sense? So the reduction is actually required in this way. Now, to the extent that this is true of interfaces that operate at the level of the single appliance, it operates at the level of the kind of aggregation and assemblages and nested assemblages of those interfaces and appliances that we call the city. And so it's not surprising in any regard that we use and navigate and relate ourselves to the city through these kinds of cartographic reductions. The idea that interfaces are in a way kinds of maps, and that in turn maps are a kind of interface. This convertibility is to be expected in that way. All right, so. Okay, a point about the sovereignty issue here as well. One of the things that I talk about at some length within the book in relation to what I call a platform sovereignty is that these systems and the interfaces allow for an interaction with the infrastructure that is sometimes much more open than that other forms of institutional systems might allow for. So on the one hand, while we want to be attentive to the kinds of coercive and incarcerating logics of an urban interfacial regime in the way in which Deleuze and Berillio would talk about it, I don't think it's all bad news, and in many ways don't share their resignation and pessimism. One way in which I don't, I think, is through the through the recognition that the conditions of the conditions of social interaction, political interaction, economic interactions, merely mechanical interactions that urban interfaces allow for, are the ones that are in many ways more universal than those that other political systems might provide for. In the near-term sense, we understand that infrastructures provide for, infrastructures are available to those who are capable of using them and are for the most part agnostic as to the other legal and political status of those users. Right? A voting booth as an interface cares if you're a citizen, but a freeway doesn't care if the state sees you as a citizen or a non-citizen. And so your legal status of being as being a credentialized or non-credentialized agent is the infrastructure essentially doesn't care. And many of the platforms that we use that organize the city in these ways that we're increasingly relying on also don't care. As more and more of the city, let's put it this way, as the cloud platforms on which we increasingly rely take on, not necessarily by legislative decision, but take on more and more and more of the functions and roles that the nation state had used to provide, and to the extent that those cloud platforms are agnostic as to the, let's say, just could keep with the example, the relative citizen or non-citizen status of each one of the users, then the relative citizen or non-citizen status of the user is less important in terms of their ability to use that particular site or situation. This is, if not a universal suffrage, at least a kind of provisional suffrage that opens up the space of participation in ways that it previously hadn't been for people. It also, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, that this position of the user, which is nothing we can talk, that is a much bigger topic, is also one that's available not only to humans but to non-human entities, and thus the suffrage becomes much larger. And so, it's these kinds of things that we want to amplify, as opposed to reduce. Okay, so I went halfway through here. There's really two other points that I wanted to get at in this time, and then we can open it up for some conversation. And I'm going to do them, however, for the sake of this, is a little bit out of order from how they appear in this piece. The talk, by the way, the notes for the talk that I'm doing, by the way, if you're interested in it, is from an essay that's in, I think, still the current issue of Log, which is a long excerpt from the Stack book. It was one that sort of specifically speaks to this as well. So if you want to, I raise this only because if you want to go through this a bit more, it's available there. Okay, very quickly, and I want to say a few questions on this, on envelope, apparatus, and programmability, and then I'll conclude with some discussion of parametricism, form finding, and say some unkind words at Patrick's expense. First, on the envelope and apparatus, there's another essay with which I assume you're probably familiar, Alejandro Zaropolo's Politics of the Envelope essays from a few years ago. He makes an argument that I still think in many ways is quite valid, in that the logic is that the physical posture of a building envelope is not something that only expresses or symbolizes a condition of political power, but it physically, in and of itself, regardless of the client, regardless of the ideology on whose behalf it is instantiated, that it physically, imminently, immediately organizes groups, crowds, swarms, in particular positions, postures, subdivisions, agglomerations, stacks, verticalities, piles, in particular ways that have a direct political, that are themselves direct political manifestations. They are not representations of a political logic. They are, in the same way a crowd is different than an individual, that a two group is different than 10,000, that they organize these polities imminently. I have several cautions with the way he articulates this, but the basic point, I think, is valid. It's also valid, however, when we talk about the logic of not just of physical envelopes at the architectural urban scale, but also of what we could call, for lack of a better word, of virtual envelopes. that there's ways in which that the immaterial, invisible, largely immaterial, largely invisible in terms of the way we experience them at least, spaces of telecommunications and information technology as they course through the city and operate as the lifeblood of a different kind of, let's call it a kind of virtual realm. That they're, as we've discussed, that they're not ubiquitous in the same way, but they have particular logics of concentration, of subdivision, of coercion, of segmentation, of decision-making. And the different configurations of the virtual envelope have the same kind of immanent political logic that the configurations of the physical envelope do. There's different ways in which you would segment and subdivide a space according to the separation and jurisdictions of information and the ways in which it works, as you would with the physical envelope. And what design needs to be better at doing is understanding the integration and interweaving of these things as the possibility of anything that we'd want to call programmability. And in a piece published many years ago, I talked about this a bit in terms of the relationship of the handset to the programmability of the space. It was written around the, I don't know, we might think almost 10 years ago, I guess. But the idea was basically this, is that the way in which that architecture is traditionally thought about, has visualized and understood the programmability of space has been through a kind of, I mean, I'm not making any, I'm not making a claim about, I'm not making a total claim here, but is largely in many cases through a planometric perspective. That program is understood to be it can be subdivided according to the segmentation of activities within particular zones, the likelihood and adjacencies and distribution and distance between particular zones within a planometric perspective, the way in which we work this out. Now, I realize that there's a whole different tradition around section, and I'm not trying to make an argument about plan per se. It really has to do more with the question of program as being something that's contained within a particular zone, and that the compositional logic of a particular program is in the adjacencies and distinctions of those zones. However, in a condition in which how it is that a user is actually making use of that space, and happened is making use of that space, is as much determined by, or at least participated in by, to take this more banal example, the app that they're using at that particular time. Whereas for one person, this zone is a game board. For another place, it's a site of a meeting. For another place, it's something else. That all the way that within a particular site at a particular time, you have 100 people in there using 100 different software platforms. That the actual use and activity that's taking place in that site may be just as diverse as the kinds of software that is being run in that space at a particular point in time. And so and never more then can any programmatic strategy be purified of that contamination by the software-driven use of the user. Okay, so now back to I'll end with this discussion I'll end with this discussion of parametricism and the spreadsheet designed city. And then we can have some more discussion. Okay. If as I've discussed, and I think in different ways, that too much of our actually existing urban understanding of the stack as such is obsessed, at least for the time being, with the optimization of forms of municipal arrangements that we might take to be doomed, and the marketing of these smart city solutions to urban managers who don't actually control what they think they can control. This is still not to be necessarily. This is not to be unexpected in many cases. If we go back to from say, Arcozoom's no-stop city through MVR-DV's excursion and capacities and all the rest of this. The idea and understanding of the city as an already full and overly dense informational space by which a kind of by which the design of a city is understood as a compositional rearrangement of modules within what is in essence a closed loop information metabolism. We see a similar logic in the way in which that consultant-driven urbanism also understands the city, but in a much different, but with a much different understanding of the role of design in for this. More visible than the esoteric forces of production and consumption, but no less important as governance interfaces, are the architectural surfaces and envelopes that articulate a physical and figural politics of urban space. At the same time, that spatial planning management consultants, McKinsey and Cisco and IBM, all the rest of the ones who are in many ways really winning the city-making game. At the same time that these consultants employ predictive financial models to ensure that they suppose a preferred quality of urban and economic performance, architectural design studios increasingly rely on generative algorithms as form-finding agents to calculate individual building and morphologies in pursuit of other, sometimes conflicting performative goals. This is, of course, not news to any of you. Now, the division of labor between the formal economics and design form sometimes bedevils progressive architectural design, a disciplinary project relegated to a thinner and thinner slice of the structural pie. And among the most, and as we all observe, among the most emblematic and perhaps visually striking formal machinations of today's vanguard are perhaps those gathered improperly, I think, under the rubric of parametricism. These practices and techniques, more diverse than they may seem at first glance to the uninitiated, use algorithms as design agents for the partially automated genesis of complex forms, and also to guarantee, it is hoped, an intelligent index of the intrinsic and extrinsic forces that couch a project's programs. This is at least Patrick Schumacher's argument about them, that the forms by which, that the variables that parametric models are able to index and accommodate are not just ones by which kind of formal delicacy can be composed, but the actual quantitative matrices and measures that would determine ultimately the economic and urban performance of the building can be represented and mitigated into the form itself, in theory. In theory, important design solutions, programmatic circulation, interarticulation of subcomponents, site posture, material distortion, proportion and nested symmetry, energy administration, all of these, it's argued, find direct formal expression by the mediation of the envelope as machine. I'm suspicious of this. As one contemporary derivation of Darcy Thompson's form as a diagram of forces, this version of parametricism is often extremely self-conscious self-theorization, claims to use architectural form to communicate, is the key word, the social, economic, and ecologic and cognitive forces after having been codified somehow into grasshopper scripts, and which are now disposed to express themselves through the exacting distortions of involute morphology. Project by project, it concentrates expertise on the delineation of bones, surfaces, and skins at the unit level of individual envelopes, hoping to capture the lightning in the bottle of global forces into these programmable metallic flora. Now, this strategy clearly is partially a response to the diminished and decorative economic position of even famous architects in the post-Bilbao era, but it's also supported by much broader and more substantial disciplinary interests, especially those who would not consider themselves parametricists as such. in-surface performance, living and non-living emergent systems, and alternative topologies for, as the loci for future design, as consolidated by some global signal style. And they also speak, I think, more interestingly, to the unsure agency of algorithms in the design and organization of space beyond the professional domain of architecture and architects. Now, pessimistically, we may lament that the impoverished perch from which architecture has authority now to say which assemblages go where, now reduced to variously thrilling or bombastic skins, shells, and special effects. Optimistically, we might say that in these same post-Euclidean habitats, the stage is set for new, complex, and challenging points of tactile encounter between human and architectural bodies that don't just index client programs, they forcefully reinvent them. More than perfect obedience to macroeconomic energistic fields, the creative promise of continuous involuted form involves perverse moments of folded contact and nested cohabitation between unlike bodies, fleshes, and forms. For the moment, parametricism and related programs may have won a particular circumscribed battle to represent early 20th century super contemporary style for airport cities. But architecture in general has badly lost the war for the design of urban space. And the two are at least partially correlated. Instead of design studios, it is, as I say, management consultants from McKinsey, Morgan Stanley, Halliburton, Cisco, Siemens, IBM that are winning the city-making game. And they have a rather different interest, design interest, in the flows of algorithmic capital and its spastic valuations of land and energy and information and human capital. They too can be said to render the city layer as an imprint of the layers above and the layers below, and they possess an equally deliberative mechanism to structure urban systems accordingly. Their topological imaginary is not the folded surface, but the calculative grid. And as any disinterested alien intelligence would observe today, the most efficacious parametric software is Microsoft Excel. In effect, management consultant-driven design has dislodged architecture and traditional urbanism from the prime seat of authorship over urban form. And as new space becomes a form-finding byproduct of speculative space use and site cost simulations, their methods pull data-driven design from deeper strata of the stack and telescope descriptive and prescriptive algorithms set in motion at the cloud layer and now built up as the local franchises into urban or urban-ish investments. Their spatial system economics often outpaces legal codification, leveraging an arbitrage of gaps, generative accidents of interfacial sovereignty, sometimes also hatching themselves therein. Their portfolios can be measured in millions of square kilometers, but it seems that the quantity of officially futuristic cities is inversely proportional to the quality of their futurism. Now totalistic, not really totalitarian, smart city initiatives form global information technology, and from global information technology companies such as the Cisco's, IBM, and the rest, have borne real fruit for those offering them, often finding clients in sovereign capital funds or in sovereign governments directly. They are also, it should be said, in no way allergic to collaboration with or subcontracting to globally known architectural design firms. And this mix of, quote, real architects and urbanists with consultants and IT systems architects and ministers is neither intrinsically offensive nor automatically fortunate, but it does alter the relative tabula rasa on which synthetic megacities are built. No more Brasilia, Tsukuba Science City, and the like. We now have variations of J.G. Ballard's Supercon in Masdar, Foster and Partners, Skolkovo, Cisco, Songdo City, Cisco and IBM, Kaust, Saudi Arabia, IBM, HOK, and so on. These moon bases on Earth are spliced from Soviet science cities, Silicon Valley campuses, Orange County gated communities, and a mutual understanding between political despotism and technological innovation. They are what cities look like in the shadow of airports, special economic zones, and sustainability mandates. Some of these would redefine city-states as carefully policed service platforms. And for this, their urban planning expertise relies on CRM, customer relationship management, DRM, digital rights management, server virtualization, end-user usage metrics, object synchronization across multiple devices, and device synchronization across multiple data objects, at least as much as it does on architectural design, and often not at all on things that are normally thought to make cities interesting. And so, like all Ballardesque metropoli, these cities are post-interesting, which is itself interesting. And so, contrary to parametricism's claims, figural virtuosity is subordinated to building forms that are recognizable and ad hoc, popular and stupid, but amenable to real estate metrics that outvote other politics of the envelope. A partial list of these benchmarks, which we'll conclude with: on-site carbon footprint minimization, energy and water management, replaceable and recombinant building materials, perimeter gate security, civic control contingency planning, bomb-resistant membranes, crowd circulation administration, tightly curated digital signage, assigned parking spaces, account credit issuing recycling bins, and for some, separate public entrances for citizens, tourists, women, unclean animals, and service staff. Thank you. Okay, on time. So, I hope these those sections have provided some food for thought for our discussion. We can start now, and we can continue in the seminar as well.
I just had like I kind of thought about the description relative to Foucault of the gate and the use of the physical as a constraining method or a way of kind of organizing and policing the population, I guess. As particularly in relationship to kind of Bentham, Foucault, and Panopticon, in which the architecture was designed to create a condition where a prisoner, was like we all know, was unaware of when they were being perceived and when they weren't. And as a real practice, that tended to create a kind of correlational increase in psychotic behavior development in the prisoners. But it doesn't seem dissimilar from the situation that we all currently inhabit in the non-contained space of the cities, where we are still being watched continuously, potentially whether or not, but it doesn't seem to generate the same sorts of
psychoses, or right, the same kind of yeah.
So is that to suggest that then maybe architecture isn't the way to address that type of behavioral control or interface?
It depends. Well, clearly it depends on what you want to count as architecture in that way, and what scale and what forms of mediation and interfacial performance you're willing to claim as an architectural problem. But it's an the point that you make is an interesting one. Now, just to clarify for others what Casey's talking about, the Panopticon Effect, as most of you probably know, Jeremy Bentham's plan for prison, is one in which the prisoners are both individuated into particular cells, right? The legal case of the prisoner is replicated in the architectural discreteness of them as in a particular cell. But also importantly, they can be observed from a central position by a guard, but cannot see the guard observing them in turn. and so must assume at any point in time that they are potentially being observed, and so in essence internalize the potentiality of that observation as being constant, and behave as if they, in essence, behave as if they are being observed, even if and when they're not. So if you have a camera in your bedroom, regardless of hanging from the wall, looking at you while you sleep, which I don't recommend, but if you did, you would behave as if this camera, you don't know whether it's connected to anything, you don't know if you're being watched, and so you behave as if you do. And as it turns out, the prisoners would, in essence, be more behaved and acquiescent to the program, even if they weren't being observed, if there was a mechanism in place that would suggest that the potential was there. I think what we have now is what I call the, compared to a present condition, one in which when we, every time you make a search, you make a phone call, you buy a plane ticket, you do any kind of banking, you log onto a site with cookies, you respond to any advertisement and all the rest of this. You're building up a series of profiles about yourself, some of which are available to formal governments, some of which are treated as just sort of as commodities to be resold to other advertisers and the rest of this. We live in a situation where we actually are being surveilled all of the time, but we get on with our lives regardless of it in some sort of way. And so if the Panopticon effect is that you don't know if you're being watched, you probably aren't being watched. You don't know if you're being watched, and so you behave as if you are. The inverse Panopticon effect, which is what I think we have now, is one in which you know you're being watched, but you behave as if you're not. A kind of exhibitionism in bad faith. I think both of these are available to certain kinds of, they both have a psychiatric tenor and tone to them, but I don't think they're quite the same in this way as well. And I don't think, and ultimately the issue, the relation to this may not would be the work. I think the issues have to, some of the metaphorical issues, the metaphorical and allegorical terms that we use to talk about the very peculiar ways in which our activities are made public, or at least known to others or available to others in ways in which we don't have certain accountability for. Terms like opacity, transparency, secrecy, visibility, invisibility. These are all terms and techniques that architecture is quite familiar with. The dynamics of opacity and transparency, of reflection, the different way, just the parameter, just the mechanisms by which one understands line of sight and the performative capacities of glass. Literally Rowan Slutsky, as per WikiLeaks, is the way to work with. And so I think there's any number of projects from Dylan Scafidio's Brasserie to the Thomas Leeser's one-sided mirror, public bathroom, to all the ways in which these kinds of things are played out. I think architecture's role within that dynamic has always been essential and continues to be, but in many different ways. There's one hand in which we understand how it is that those kinds of the kind of platform politics of a relentless transparency that is one way, that there's a means by which all of your activities is known to some other entity, but you don't know the means by which it's known to that entity, that is correspondent to that panopticon sort of effect. There's ways in which architecture works as the support mechanism, or at least the stage set, if not the actual apparatus for that mechanism, that I think we understand and identify. We also know that there isn't just one panoptic regime. There are multiple panoptic regimes at work, and that those panoptic each panoptic regime may have within its own terms and parameters a kind of ubiquitous line of sight on what's going on. It doesn't have the same level of transparency what the other panoptic regime is seeing and what it's up to. It can only see what it's trained to see and not what it's not trained to see. And I think part of the paradoxes of the situation have to do with, I think, a lack of understanding about the multiplicity of those totalities. We ask, how is it that an airliner can disappear in an ocean, in a world in which we can track every FedEx package to the square millimeter? How do you lose an airplane? It's because there's not just this one regime, right? There's these multiple, and they're in fact contradictory in one way or another. Now, the question of public space and private space, which is one that has animated the way in which architecture has dealt with opacity and transparency. I mean, literally, Colin Rowe to Neutra to the rest of this, is one, it has to do with in many cases, a construction of a particular individuated subjective relationship to habitat versus a public relationship and accountability and accommodation of others. To be seen, to not be seen, to mediate or to distort or to deflect or to unmanage this relationship of the inside to the outside, and so forth and so on, right? It comes down in many cases to what kind of corner do you make, and does this corner, bring the inside to the outside and the rest of this. All the ways in which architecture has dealt with this as a means by which it produces its own subjects through habitation. The ways in which, and this goes to, there's nothing new in this, right? It goes to Lefebvre's notion of habitus as being, the way in which habits create a particular habitat, wearing groove into the space over time, and in turn the way those habitats train habits that we have with them. Architecture interpolates subjects. It does so, it always has, and it will continue to be in this way. The fact that and it always has done so in ways in which it itself is interwoven and interlinked with systems that exceed itself, and so its own, where its boundaries exist, maybe in some ways homologous to how it structures those boundaries in the project, right? Does that make sense? Are continuous. Today, the question is the notions of public and private that we have grown up with in different ways are, I'm not going to say that they're somehow just completely irrelevant or disrupted off the table in any sort of way as well, but that they're certainly reconfigured in ways in which more habitual vocabularies about describing our expectations around these things need to be re-examined and recomposed and redefined. I'm for one, I don't think that the kind of Tor WikiLeaks model of a totally encrypted, opaque, individuated subject that isn't available, that is utterly withdrawn from social scrutiny and accountability is a scalable condition for the proper geopolitics of this user-subject position. I don't think it scales properly in this way. I understand the rationale of it, but I'm not a fan of hyper-individuated understandings of how societies work in general. However, the general question, I think the real key, among the key design questions that I think that the stack thesis provokes is this shift from what we could call user-centered design to the design of the user. And how it is that this political subject, economic subject, machinic subject, technical subject, urban subject, called the user, which can be human or non-human, citizen, non-citizen, all these kinds of things, what its parameters, its obligations, its rights and responsibilities are, is the constitutional and compositional project of which we have enormous attention to play. The question of the domains of privacy and publicity, the traces that we leave, the accountability that we have, the rights to anonymity, of discretion, of what's seen and not seen, by whom and how and where those questions are found, is central to this. So this question of how architecture interpolates its subject is intrinsic to the question of how it is that how it is that the public position or private position of the user is made so, which is intrinsic to this larger compositional logic, this problem of the composition of the user as such. And so in addition to staging these things, the kinds of experimental and research-driven projects that architecture can develop, can work in this as well, can have very important effects beyond architecture itself. They can have effects and can produce data, if you like, that will tell us potentially much more important things about who that user is, where they are, what they are, and how we might conceptualize them and design and redesign them.
I wanted to add.
Yeah, John, sorry.
One thing, as you were talking, recently there was an article, you probably read it on the app Waze. It's like it's called Waze.
Yeah.
It's the traffic thing. And I wanted your thoughts on this, because it seems that this would be an example of, let's say, as opposed to the airport as you present as a kind of streamlined, efficient example of all these parameters. The article was about a neighborhood that had been, at certain traffic periods of a freeway, people were directed into a neighborhood.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the city didn't change.
Right.
The access to
That's right.
information did.
Right.
What I found interesting about the article was then the people in the neighborhood were logging onto Waze and putting their phones in their cars parked to fool Waze to think that those streets had too much traffic, therefore there wouldn't be any more. And this kind of push-pull back. And then, of course, Waze countered that and had some kind of algorithm that could tell, the car doesn't move a certain amount of time. It's not really a car. So I thought that this was really interesting, in a literal way, how we look at cities and how things are changing, how technologies push and pull. But it always seems like there's, for every mode of efficiency, et cetera, maybe this gets into the interface that you were talking about, where there's a reaction back, where there's adjustment.
Absolutely, yeah. And they don't know, and there's totally, it's a great point, and I completely agree. But the image of the airport that's presented here is not, there's a stylistic seamlessness to these processes, but I think as your point makes clear, that the predator-prey camouflage disclosure relationships between that animate the ecology of an algorithmic urbanism are always one that we should never expect will result immediately or even in time into some kind of resolved homeostatic sort of condition, that these dynamics are always at work, and yet they get displaced into other sorts of ways. I mean, in a general sense, for Early's argument of the invention of any new technology is also the invention of a new kind of accident holds here. But at the same time, as I say, the inversion of this, that the invention of any new accident is also the invention of a new kind of technology. And so part of what's interesting about this Waze situation is not only, well, you have this kind of, what we seem to be an algorithmic optimization that has clear winners and losers in this way, right? And that has a differential value on quality of life and real estate costs and how it sort of works as well, can be counteracted by other kinds of things, right? By which, does this introduce a different kind of differential parking market by which the establishment of the thing that the parked cars must do in a particular way is to interact with the wayfinding vectors in such a way that they can countervail or somehow counterweight those initial kinds of reactions. In other words, it just keeps going. And I think these are to your point, it's those reverberations and the attention to those reverberations that is essentially, that's the real site condition, right? Is the oscillation and playback between those kinds of dynamics. That's that what we may think of as that kind of in between or transference point isn't in between at all. That's in fact space, right? That street and the Waze app are in essence are kind of the in between things. The other thing that I think is interesting, I mean, the app Waze is interesting in a number of different ways. When it was first there was a precursor to this was, in a different version of what you were getting at, was a London subway app. And initially, when it was very, very popular initially, and it had the immediate effect of routing people through the unlikely but faster routes, which then clogged those routes. And it became a self-canceling mechanism that wasn't able to adjust the outcomes of its own recommendations fast enough. It was a broken thermostat in this sort of way. But the thing that I think is interesting about Waze, and this goes to this other question of the design of the user and the composition of the user as such, one of the things that I think that interface design in general, and if we take a much more universal Catholic understanding of interface design as not just buttons with words on it, but these conditions of agential transference, is that it's bound into a particular logic of HCI, of human-computer interaction, that presumes a single first-person user, one person clicking on one set of buttons with one interface with one kind of reaction, right? That primal scene scenario of interface design is always hyper-individuated. Waze is an excellent example of a kind of multi-user interface, where it isn't the individual user, it's an entire aggregation of users together that are combined, that produce this together, and that the plural and quasi-anonymous, not purely, but quasi-anonymous relationship between these as composite users. For one particular point in time, all of those people driving along Wilshire Boulevard, instead of Olympic, form a kind of composite user. They team up in a certain kind of way. And the sovereign status of that composite user versus the individual user, the designability of the composite user in relation to individual users, particularly in that each of these users is, on an individual level, also a certain kind of cyborgian agent. It's not just you, it's your car, right? The car has the status of the thing as well. These are all exactly the things that I think need to be dealt with, not as peculiar, advanced, avant-garde, real, sort of like new, unusual things. These are, to me, really the core questions. This is the site condition, as I say. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Benjamin.
Yeah.
In your study of airports, I was wondering if you could tell us any insights that you might have found about the temporal condition of the modern airport, of the contemporary airport, whether it be one of atemporality, simultaneity, synchronic time, diachronic time.
Yeah. Well, part of I think the phenomenological effect of the airport as an avant-garde of the generic city is an experience of the movement between two airports, not as a movement through time, but as a movement through, not as a movement through space, but a movement through time. Right? You arrive where you ended up in a certain sort of way. It looks just like, as opposed to in ye olden days where you go from one city to another city and you clearly have a distinction between one or the other. Now you arrive where you started from. And so there's an experience of the movement through space that's essentially measured in a kind of, in terms of your biological clock. Cities are their distance is 3 hours or 5 hours or 8 hours or so forth. We understand this in this way. The first class that Hernan and I taught together when we did the X Lab, we did the series of 8 or 9 classes together here at SCI-Arc, where I would do a seminar, and he would do the studio based on the same brief. The first one we did was on airports. And the brief that I wrote for the studio was one in which the students had to design that first-person movement through airport world as if it was a single space. So you go from the lounge to the boarding area, to the cabin of the plane, to the boarding area, to the lounge. So you experience this space as a kind of a series of stages of stage set that's reassembled around you in a way as you move through it. And it's the coherency of that arc that was the design problem to be solved, and try to think about this and the kinds of clashes or continuities that would be resolved with this as well. And so I think this is a kind of simple, a kind of easy, low-hanging fruit kind of example, but I think one that by which those kinds of stitches can be thought of in different ways. When my son was, another thing that came up, when my son was about 4, he took his first plane trip. Was very excited about the whole thing and over the airports and the rest of this. And after we landed, I asked him what he thought of all of this, what was going on, and the rest of this. And he said, well, what he thought of airports. He said, well, airports are, he had 2 things to say. One was airports are people-making machine. You go to the airport and the people that you want to meet get sort of spit out by this machine. It's like if you want this person, grandma or whoever, you go to the airport and it spits her out, which is true. But also that the airports have this function of time. It's like the longer you spend, you go in the machine, and what happens when you go in there is that they remake the world around you. This is a very solipsistic 4-year-old, you can see. But and the longer you spend in there, the more time they have to reorganize the world around you, and so the more different it is when you leave. If you go in there for half an hour, it's not so different. You go in there for a long time, it's a lot different as well. I think in just one way or another, we all experience airports in this kind of way. I hope that's a useful answer to your question as well. Was there another take on the question of temporality that you particularly you had a thought on that perhaps I could speak to differently?
It's clear that when you're navigating the space of an airport, you're moving not only through space but through time, and like you'd said, the demarcations of distances between cities, right? But then the longer, as you just mentioned, the longer that you spend within an airport, and we've got all of our devices, as you know, the diagnosis of the condition that you've outlined, I think is spot on. But the more time that we spend in the airport, the more time that we can connect and not be in one. We can be in multiple places at one time, multiple times in one place. So, you know, I was thinking about a number of writing about atemporality, this condition of atemporality, right? So
right.
I want to know if there were any sort of insights born from the most recent study.
Well, I think it depends on how long you're there. I suppose to do with the question of how much history has passed. I suppose as you move through this in this way. One of the things that's interesting to me about also the airports is that function of miniaturization that's at work, where on one scale the airport is a kind of miniaturization of the city. It has all of taking the sort of Swiss Army knife essential generic functions of cities. And as you move further into it, that is reminiaturized again into a smaller sort of habitat. And then once you're in flight, the entire world has been compressed into just the essentials of peanuts and magazines and bathrooms. And that turns out that's really the essential kit of civilization, at least for beer, at least for this period of time. And then this process of reminiaturization. Again, so it's a bit like the old, whatever it was called, the Shrinking World ride at Disneyland that had since been replaced, where you move down to the scale of cells and molecules and atoms and then back up again, and this reminiaturization. So there's this kind of temporal compression at work, but I also think that's to some extent why airplanes and airports or it's not the only reason, such an attractive target for political violence and terrorism. There's a way in which that, because of that process of compression, I think, that the airplane and the airport is able to represent and embody the whole world at once. And in this sense, it becomes token and symbolic of the whole world at once. To take that space is to, in a way, take the whole world at once. It's to hijack not just this plane, but to hijack all that which is compressed into the generic universal of that plane itself. And so the more generic and the more universal airport space becomes, the more significant it is, the less significant individual differences are within the airport, but the more significant it is as a site of capture or of contestation, because it represents a universal rather than a particular. Yeah, thanks.
My question is also about airports, but this kind of sort of coexistence of entertainment and security.
Yeah.
And I think you showed an image of it, this sort of concentrated, roped-off area through which you sort of snake through and actually remove items of clothing, open your bags, and kind of undergo a very kind of concentrated moment of scrutiny,
right.
And then after which you're ejected into these fake lounges, fake cafes, as almost like a form of recovery to that traumatic moment of kind of being investigated and knowing that you are being investigated. So my question would be, that sort of entertainment or pseudo-lounging, I don't know what to call it, but these forms of like kind of recovery or
therapeutic of some sort.
Therapeutic in a way, yeah. How necessary are these sort of things to a kind of system that operates on a kind of very rigorous form of security or kind of probing or kind of breaking away of what we think is private
Yeah.
or our own kind of sphere of the privacy of the individual.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a really interesting observation. Yeah, there's a the ways in which, forms of official therapeutic techniques for traumatized persons, is teddy bears, blankets, and drawing out what happened to you, or other sorts of things that might be seen in what happens after you go through the security line. I mean, perhaps you could have a thing where you take out your wallet, take off your shoes, you go through this security guard, and then there's someone there to hug you as you come through, and then you can go on your way. We need the official hugger as part of the TSA or something like this. But because it is this very strange moment in a way that, I mean, for some people it's less strange than others. For some people, being accosted by police authorities, being asked to take things out of their pockets, being asked to submit their person to pat down or other forms of suspicious observation is more of an everyday occurrence. And so airports are, and so to this extent, what happens at the airport is probably more, it probably means something quite differently in a different way than it may for other people, for whom it's a very peculiar event to be, for the state to look at your underwear in this way. It's interesting legalistically it's interesting in a different sort of way as well. It's a site of exception, a state of exception in the Agamben sense of exception, that this is some kind of, it's like a 5-minute state of emergency, where it's a regularized 5-minute state of emergency where the normal constitutional and legal provisions are suspended, by which any other sort of rights, the constitutional rights to unreasonable search and seizure and privacy, and certainly, hopefully, Second Amendment, and the rest are suspended. But it's not an interminable condition, like the camps are an interminable condition, or the sort of refugee status is an interminable, ongoing condition without particular knowable end. It has a regularity to it. It's the unexceptional exception that's actually built into, and the entire infrastructure of the rest of the airport is now configured around that site. They have what's called clean zones and unclean zones, or air side and street side, in this as well. And once you go through this orifice and are determined, filtered as being safe, then this whole rest of this world is opened up to you in a particular way. And so it really is, within the airport, that linchpin by which the entire rest of the space is organized around that filtering mechanism. The whole building is designed to run an X-ray machine, in essence. Now, the other point you're making about the relative trauma of that and the kind of militarized entertainment or entertaining militarization that happens to the rest of it, I think is probably an interesting point. Probably would be worth developing more narratively than through other kinds of things. I guess maybe the way I would enter into this to think about the kind of shift in the interpolated subjectivity that moves through here. Like, you go into the airport and you're essentially before you get into the security line, everything you've done in that city and your itinerary and your intentions and the rest of that is your own, in a way. You're specifically of your own, determined by your own itinerary and volition and biography and experience. But as once you get in the line, you become, in essence, a kind of universal citizen, a universal subject, universal citizen object of sorts. It doesn't matter who you are, right? You can be a famous person, regular person, nobody person, whatever. You're all essentially a body to be observed and screened and filtered in this regard. And so all of the other social differentiations that may color the kinds of access that you have throughout your life are all, in essence, bracketed for this moment in which you are in this 5-minute state of emergency, reduced to a body that may or may not have knives or guns or flammable liquids. And once that filtering algorithm is satisfied, then you go through the process of some sense of, I suppose, of some sort of recovery of those states of social differentiation that might decide who you are and the rest of that. And perhaps that's why, that's why magazines are, that's why you have these ways in which the kinds of choices and availability and access and the rest of this is available for you to sort of go through and rehearse those purchases or intentions of likes and dislikes and the rest of it, to recover those specific privileges that are set aside as you move through it, to degenericize yourself in a way. So I think if the point I'm sort of making is, I like the idea of the reason that the entertainment works this way is in lieu of the hugger, or the tray of cupcakes, or the pony as you go through it. But I think it also has to do with a kind of therapeutic inversion of the trauma of social de-differentiation that takes place, and a staging for the means by which that redifferentiation can be staged. Yeah. I got a whole thing on frequent flyer miles too. No, I'm joking. I know. Yeah, Casey, please. Yeah, I'm happy to go as long as you want. Yeah.
Well, I kind of going back to the earlier statement that there are multiple panopticons in operation.
Yeah, right.
Now. One of the things I think in a conversation recently, someone was discussing the group Anonymous and whether or not people join. The discussion was kind of discussing whether or not to join that group for its purposes. And one of the things that I think is kind of interesting is that the Big Brother is no longer exclusively a state kind of operation as an Orwell prediction, but also something that's now become a kind of mob mentality, self-organizing machine where Anonymous operates through a kind of collective ethic that they've emerged from that group, but with the same kind of failings that the state has in terms of, it's frequently wrong, it excessively persecutes people in the way that the police state does through kind of primarily online distribution of information, social shaming, and those types of things. As a designer and as a kind of architect operating within the realm now where it's unclear where the roles of control and social manipulation are coming from, as no longer simply a state-organized thing.
Yeah.
Whereas the Panopticon obviously was very clearly a state form of behavioral control.
Right. But now you may be less worried whether the NSA is reading your Gmail than whether or not some guy on Reddit on 4chan is going to dox you. Yeah. If you say something bad about, you say something he doesn't like about video games, you'll ruin your. Yeah.
Or he may misidentify an element in some kind of leak report and say you're a member of the clan, whether or not you actually are. And probably on aggregate, they're statistically probably more right than wrong.
Right. But the function of social shaming is an important part of the way in which, and it's not just anonymous. I mean, I think part of the right, but let's say part of the what Jaron Lanier called a digital Maoism of a kind of mob. I mean, he meant it very derisively as a kind of mob rule of this. That shaming through an undesired transparency, that you've lost, that it's been determined by the Anonymous People's Council that you've lost the right to privacy because of some social transgression, and so all of this dirty laundry will be aired, right? That the punishment that's provided is, instead of you being removed from this society and kept in a box, you're left to live your life as you have you have as always, but you do so in this state of shame, supposedly, right? People know these things about you and the rest of this as well. So if I'm following, I'm just sort of re-articulating in my own words what I think with the scenario that I think you're saying. And yeah, I think it's all part and parcel of this. And speaks to also, I think, the way in which the centralization decentralization dynamic that I spoke to is at work. It's not enough to look at things like states and these big immovable institutional figures as a site of some kind of unwanted Oedipal authority that can be undermined by some kind of, these terms, these radically horizontal, non-hierarchical systems, and equate this instinctively and forevermore as the mechanism of social justice per se. For any, it's from Gamergate to anything, as many examples as you wish to find down the line. It's the political and economic, the political and psychological logic of these are ones that are as dubious and as fraught and as convertible and as double-sided as any of them. So I think it's a good observation in this regard.
Yeah, I think as a designer, the basic observation was, on one hand, the kind of state-formulated security is an easier issue to engage with as an architect. Whether it's in the design of the security system,
or in any kind, or for philosophy, or for political theory. I mean, in each place that we go to, there's an axiomatic presumption that by decentralizing the system, or by making certain actors opaque to others and transparent to others in certain kinds of ways, that this is intrinsically a progressive disruption of the situation. That the flattening and deterritorialization of the institution is axiomatically the mechanism that we wish to go to. I think you see this not just in architecture but across the board. We may, in fact, it may be in certain ways the more provocative gesture to invert that in some way, to think about more comprehensive forms of radical re-centralization, not necessarily hierarchicalization, but some sort of form of deliquification of the space of flows, such that a kind of composable consistency might be able to better guarantee the kinds of outcomes that we might want to compose on behalf of.
Thank you for the lecture. In your long article, you say how the stack, the megastructure, is like it becomes like a solution, but by itself, it's like the poison.
It's what?
Poison. You stated.
Poison? Yeah. Poison or remedy. Yeah. Pharmacon. Yeah.
But going back to the airport, what I took out of it is that we as humans, or as users of U-state, we become like dehumanized or desensitized.
Desensitized? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Because we all become like deprived of our privacy and of all our like amendments and all of this. And I'm trying to think if, because all of these are systems, the way that it works, maybe how could they be redesigned or in a way fixed to not become this desensitized or dehumanizing of us humans, or if it should be fixed. I don't know.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? To the extent to which we'll entertain the argument that the airport is this metonymic stand-in for the city, and the city is the metonymic stand-in for the whole of human habitat. And the question of how do you fix the airport becomes the question of how do you fix the world. This is the big question, yes, how do we do this? I think that, to speak sort of more, it's a big general question, so I'll give you a big general answer. Unless your question was not big in general and you're really talking about how do you make better airports, in which case, you probably might have.
Just in general as well, because like as you said, that airports are like the preface of cities. So yeah, it's like in general. Because I'm assuming right now is that as like time passes, like us humans, we're just like becoming this very in a way, we're doing everything very like not randomly, but like very not thoughtful. It's like we're not thinking anymore. Like we're doing everything because it's like okay, we have to wake up, go to work, and go to sleep, and etc. And like this idea of how we become desensitized.
Desensitized. Well, I think I agree with the sentiment of what you're saying. I wouldn't include any more in it. I don't think it's a situation as such that there was a time in which we had a better handle on all of this, and that we've somehow lost the plot. And with this as well, I don't think it quite goes. I don't believe in a sort of linear, progressive, things are cumulatively better logic of history, but I don't believe in the essentially conservative argument of a golden era from which we're now decaying and need to restore either. But I do track with the idea of that when you say not thinking of a certain kind of the importance of what we might take as of reason to in fact be a basis by which the composition and governance operates. If we take governance in the most general sense of how it is that a particular composition in the world, according to collectively determined outcomes and goals, is able to enforce itself against pathological its own pathological perturbations and those from sort of the outside in any other sort of way, as a compositional problem, not just something that states do, but rather something how systems do, as you say, which may include parliamentary states, but may include freeways and airports just as much, if not more in some ways. So there's a long answer and a short answer. The short answer, I think, has to do with disenchantment and demystification, which I'm very pro demystification and disenchantment. I think that, as I mentioned, and I think in the previous lecture a bit, that we're what we call Copernican traumas. The idea that if our planet isn't the center of the universe, that we're not an apex, the world is not created in our image, an apex species, neuroscience, genetics, all of these ways in which the human experience of human experience is shifted off center from the perch by which we compose the world as the dominant sapient actor of the world, are difficult, violent, traumatic operations, but absolutely priceless accomplishments that need to be amplified and supported as much as possible. In a way, disenchantment is the call to arms. I think almost for its own sake. But because I think it's ultimately the only way in which that the possibility of actually composing a livable Anthropocenic planetary condition will be possible in this way. I think the ongoing civil war within Abrahamic monotheism that we're continuously, the rest of us are dragged into day by day, is sort of exhibit A of the importance of a more activist form of general demystification and disenchantment of our predicament and experience here as well. But it's also one that, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, that seat of reason there's two important points to make about this. Or there's several, but two that I'll make now. One is that that there's a tradition that comes out of the Enlightenment and the colonial era, which is the dangerously and tragically unfortunate lamination of the notion of reason and enlightenment with Western cultural traditions, as opposed to a truly, as opposed to something that is shared more broadly and then more of a planetary condition. The presumption that reason and universality and those kinds of impetus in the Enlightenment are somehow the providence of the West isn't true, and it doesn't. I don't think it serves us ultimately to presume that to work as if they are, either from a kind of critical post-colonial position or from the chauvinistic position of a Western-centric view of these things. And so I think one of the conditions of that disenchantment and demystification to undergo is that separation of peculiar and local Western cultural mores and traditions from a more universal form of reason and rationality that may take root and which is equally available and equally expressive in human culture more broadly. The second is that it's also something that that we might define in a different way the capacity for that reason, the capacity for reason as a function of abstraction. That the capacity for any kind of thinking entity to abstract its own environment, to understand how to solve a particular problem and to abstract that solution to a completely different kind of problem space, this transversal knowledge, in the destruction of abstraction is something that's available to all different kinds of thinking. It's something that animals do, it's something that AIs do, it's something that all kinds of different forms of intelligence do. And as the previous lecture was sort of intoned, that the sooner that the real philosophical implications of research into AI and machinic perception and sensation and so forth should be one that not just we teach these machines how to think, but that in the diversity of their capacities for abstraction and reason, that we in turn learn how to think with them and situate the specific human forms of thought and reason within this larger and more diverse array. And that I think much of that is already available in terms of a study of animal cognition and the rest of this as well. And so all of which is, I think these things in a certain way, these things go together. There's very good reason why reason's got a bad rap, because was used in many ways as the rationale for the calamities and catastrophes and apocalypses of the colonial era, which we're still dealing with today, and which are in many cases part of the recipe of that civil war within Abrahamic monotheism that we're dealing with as well. And so I think that separation is a really key one. But in general, it's the simple answer is disenchantment and demystification. I think the more that we realize, that biology, our neurology works in particular kinds of ways, that there's lots of ways in which you can make babies, lots of ways in which flesh can have pleasure, lots of ways in which you can have empathy with other forms of matter in the world, and to take that as the basis of the terms of a generalized urban scale interface design, the better.